Okay, well, we are at 2 o'clock and I am recording this webinar, so we will go ahead and get started. Um, my name is John Mann, and I'm an assistant professor here at Michigan State University, and I host this series, Innovations in Agriculture and Rural Development, which is sponsored by the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar. Our title is Intermediary Perceptions of Rural Firm Tech Adoption. So before we get started with the presentation, I want to point out a few items. So it looks like everybody has answered the poll questions, so thank you for that. Also, in the chat box, I've included a couple of helpful URLs. And so if you'd like to get a recording of this webinar, you can click there. It'll be available on our YouTube page. Also, if you've got any comments or feedback, please feel free to email me. And the policy brief, which this webinar is based on, is the link to that is also there. So this particular webinar is going to be a little bit different in that we're going to ask for some feedback from the audience based on their perceptions. And so we've got a small group, so hopefully we'll have some good dialogue. And then for the presentation, it'll be about 20 to 25 minutes, and we'll allow about 10 or 15 minutes for questions and answers. So we'll see if some others join us while we're in progress. So again, I want to thank everybody for joining us and for participating today. Our presenter is Rachel Poole, and she is a senior and honor student at the James Madison College at Michigan State University, and a budget and policy assistant at the Michigan State Budget Office. Rachel is part of our research team for the USDA funded project, Launching Innovations from the University Starting Gate. So she helped us kick off the project by leading an initial investigation into the barriers rural firms face regarding technology adoption. So she's the lead author for our first of several papers related to the project. So in today's presentation, Rachel is going to share a little bit more about her research and hopefully engage with us in the audience and ask a couple of questions. So I'm going to change the screen real quick, and then I'm going to hand the reins over to Rachel.
Thank you, John, for that introduction, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to just dive right into the context behind our study. So technology adoption is a key component of a firm's competitiveness and long-term success, and this affects the economic health of the community in which the firm resides. Because of this, it's critical to identify the obstacles and opportunities that firms encounter in relation to technology adoption. For decades, rural areas have been economically disadvantaged relative to urban areas due to limited access to resources that encourage the creation and growth of innovative firms, like low-interest loans, investment capital, technology spillovers, human capital, and agglomeration economies. Rural firm ownership culture is also more risk-averse than that of urban firms, so rural firms have been much slower to incorporate new innovations into current practices. Rural firms have been shown to have lower per-firm rates of conventional innovation creation compared to urban firms, like patenting and licensing new technology, which reduces new innovation launch opportunities. Rural firms, which are often agricultural firms, have also historically been viewed as technology adoption laggards. At the same time, many of the innovations that are adopted by these firms only provide marginal changes to current practices. To compound these issues, university innovation spillovers leading to technology commercialization interact mostly with urban firms. Given this general background, we structured our study to identify the barriers that restrict rural firm success in regards to technology adoption, and determine what strategies can be used to avoid or overcome those barriers. Before we go any further, we'd like to have your initial input. A poll should pop up for you on your screen. And we'd just like to ask you, based on your experience, what is the most significant barrier restricting rural firm success in regards to technology adoption? And you have several options presented here. I'll just give you a couple minutes to look this over and then we'll move on. All right, so it looks like everybody has already responded. Thank you so much. Thanks again for the poll responses. I'll be glancing at them, and so will John as we continue on. But just to jump back into the structure of our study, the findings that we're presenting here were based on 15 interviews with staff members from 6 different types of intermediary organizations in Michigan that work closely with rural firms. The selected organization types include the USDA Rural Development, Economic Development Corporations, Small Business Development Corporations, MSU Extension, local chambers of commerce, and incubators. Participation in the study was voluntary, and participants were selected through a semi-random process while also ensuring equal representation among organization types. Participants were told that for the purpose of the study, innovation is defined broadly to include formal and non-traditional considerations. Technology is defined to include anything that increases efficiency, so not just computer or internet-based tools, and that firms of interest range in size from small coffee shops to large manufacturing facilities. To identify the barriers that restrict rural firms' success in regards to technology adoption, we asked each participant the same 3 research questions about their experiences with firms. The findings we're about to share were all gleaned from the stories they told in response to these questions. So the first was, can you tell me a story of a firm in your region that successfully adopted a new technology? The second was, can you think of a business in your region that failed to keep up with the competition and suffered as a result? And finally, we asked them, have you worked with a business that tried to adopt a new technology and didn't get it done, or did and then found that it didn't work? So jumping right into their responses, 6 of 15 respondents identified recruiting and retaining employees in rural areas as an overarching problem. Rural areas are more likely to be quite isolated and lack basic infrastructure. Anything from an essential service like a high-tech hospital to a luxury like home internet connection. Though at first glance, some of these infrastructure issues might seem frivolous, they may play a key role in influencing millennials, especially in their choice of where to live and work. It was also brought up that rural firms often pay below industry standard wages, and many are stuck in old-fashioned 8-to-5 workplace cultures. One respondent said, I find it so fascinating that we continue to be more efficient and effective in the workplace, but nothing has changed. So many places are still like, we're going to have the 8-to-5 workday. You need to be at your desk at 8, and even if you have nothing to do, stay at your desk till 5. Which the millennials and even the generations after us are like, why? If I get the work done, what does it matter how much time it takes me or where I'm at when I do it? If you don't balance that out, you're not going to retain that good talent because they're going to go someplace that's more progressive and that's flexible and figure it out from there. The difficulty of recruiting and retaining employees in rural areas was considered a human capital barrier in our study. 2 other key parts of the human capital issue identified were the local rural workforce and the issue of rural firm owners wearing many hats. In regards to the local rural workforce, 3 of 15 respondents noted that drug and alcohol abuse within their communities made it difficult to fill positions with local residents. Other respondents said that it was difficult to fill positions with community members because there isn't enough nearby vocational training. It was also mentioned that many rural businesses are family businesses, and the desire to hire family members can cause firms to overlook other potential employees or fail to encourage their younger generation to go learn or intern elsewhere for a time. The concept of wearing many hats, though cliché, was mentioned by 6 of 15 interviewees. One respondent said it best. They said, an independent small business owner has to wear so many hats. They're the bookkeeper, they're the marketer, they're the operations manager. They wear all these hats, becoming overwhelmed, just keeping the ship floating. To look at a new technology that might make my business, my day easier, oftentimes appears to be unattainable because how am I going to learn this? There's only 24 hours in a day. I'm already at full capacity and I can't take on this new thing. An attitude of resistance to change among rural firms was the most commonly discussed theme in our study and was brought up by 12 of 15 participants. Their general impression seemed to be that established businesses become comfortable in their habits, and sometimes it takes a crisis to bring them to the point where they accept that they must change. Businesses that failed to change were often discussed as examples of those that had failed to keep up with the competition and suffered as a result. In contrast, owners who were accepting of change and risk were often featured in the stories of firms who had successfully adopted new technology. An SBDC staff member described how restaurants must constantly reinvent themselves to accommodate changing clientele, but many restaurants dig in their heels. He said, well, this meatball sandwich has always been our best seller, and I can't change that recipe. Well, maybe now the market doesn't like to eat meat as much. I'm just using this as a theoretical, but don't be so married to a particular product that you sink the whole ship with it. Though an attitude of openness to change and risk can certainly contribute to the success of a firm also has to have a certain amount of financial capital to be able to afford to withstand risky endeavors. Much of the literature on rural technology adoption focuses on financial capital, but it was only mentioned by 4 out of 15 interviewees, and these respondents were split on their view of the issue. Some explain that firms in really struggling rural areas have to be more risk-averse because they can't afford to gamble on new ideas. But other interviewees argued against the influence of financial capital barriers. One explained, quote, "If they, the firm, wanted to increase their productivity through technology, the funders here would help them with that. If we could show that robotics would bring their cash flows back into alignment, the funders would be ecstatic with that. If we could show that technology could increase their productivity and allow them to get more business or have a better quality so they could raise their prices, funders would agree with that. It's not really the funding issue at all." So because of their split opinions on the issue, we would also like to have your input. So another poll should pop up on your screen. John will put that up for us. So based on your experience with rural firms, how significant is the issue of financial capital and their willingness to adopt new technologies? All right, just waiting for, yep, okay, all of the responses are in. And that's really interesting that you guys, seem to agree with the second response that I quoted, that it is easy to find funds if you do the right things. Thank you so much for chiming in. So moving on to the last theme that we found in our study, 5 of 15 respondents mentioned a lack of internet access as an infrastructure problem for rural firms. For example, a USDA rural development employee described a small business owner who lost out on an opportunity to expand her business because her broadband internet connection was not reliable or fast enough for the requirements of the program she was considering joining. Stories were shared about how this impacts large firms as well. However, several interviewees, instead of focusing on the limited access to internet, emphasized that though internet access can be limited, it is a tremendous resource for the rural firms that do have it. A staff member of an urban incubator described how she's seen rural firms use internet marketing to compensate for their isolated locations. Another incubator staff member from the Upper Peninsula discussed how the internet has changed the sales game in the UP and eliminated the bottleneck of sales-related travel. We've now discussed the main barriers to technology adoption in rural firms that our study identified: human capital barriers, resistance to change, access to financial capital, and internet access. So now we'd like to hear from you. You'll see a final poll on your screen, and we're hoping that you can tell us anything we might be missing. So based on your experience with rural firms, is there a barrier to technology adoption that we haven't covered? And after answering this question, please feel free to use this space to share any story you might have about rural firms' adoption of technology. While you take care of the poll, I'll go ahead and discuss some of our recommendations and next steps. To address human capital issues, firms are encouraged to pay higher than industry standard wages, adopt a flexible and modern workplace culture, advocate for local vocational training, and bring in consultants when possible. Firms should strive for an attitude of openness to change and, as much as possible, accept that technology adoption requires financial investment and risk. Finally, firms should leverage the internet to make up for geographic isolation and advocate for broadband expansion. The next step for our research team is to expand this study to other states. This first stage was focused only on Michigan, and the availability of resources varies considerably across regions, so we look forward to learning more about those differences. I see that several of you are still typing your response to our question, so we really appreciate that. And we can just pause here a moment to make sure you have time to share what you would like to share. And I will, open up for questions, and I think John will help us facilitate that.
Okay, we'll give just about another minute to respond to the question, and then I'm going to change the screen here. See if anybody else is going to add in. And okay, so these questions, we'll have these questions open at the very end so you can go back and look at your responses and change them if you like or add to that. So let's go ahead and go to the question and answer page. So if you would, go ahead and type your questions into the chat box below. And while we're getting started here with you and your questions, I'm going to start with a couple of my own. So Rachel, in the context of the research, and I want to revisit the idea of wearing many hats. So with some of the small businesses that I've worked with, I know they are often reluctant to hire people because they're worried about cash flow or something like that. But what's your feel based on the people that you talk to with the firms that they've worked with, and taking on the risk of adding additional help? Will they be able to pay for them, et cetera? Could you maybe speak about that just a little bit?
Yeah, it's interesting. Paying for consultants wasn't brought up as much as the distrust of consultants. Um, I heard from a few of the respondents that since many rural firms are family-owned firms, they're just hesitant to bring in an outsider. Not necessarily to protect trade secrets even, but just because they're really so used to keeping their business within their family that to bring in someone else just feels wrong. Um, so that it is interesting to consider that it also is expensive to bring in consultants and to hire more people, but this was viewed more as a resistance to change and a trust issue than a financial issue by the people I spoke with.
Cool. Well, thank you for that. So let's take Scott's question next. He asks, if you were a rural loan officer, what would you do to facilitate innovation?
That's a tricky one. One interesting thing that I touched on in the paper is that USDA rural loan officers sometimes feel like they're in this catch-22, that they, have all these government resources that they want to share with firms, but they have to find firms that need the resources, so qualify for them in that regard, but also have a little bit of cash to bring to the table because rural loans often, are only one it's only like a percentage grant, and the rest of it is truly a loan. So you have to find firms that need you but don't need you too much. So there was some frustration on behalf of the rural loan officers, um, as to how tricky it is to find that perfect firm sometimes. So I think in their minds they would like to, find ways to make those guidelines less stringent, but working with the system they have now, community decision making came up a lot. A lot of rural loan officers deal with municipalities instead of businesses. I mean, many of them deal with businesses as well, but one story that was shared was about a rural community that really needed a better wastewater treatment system. But it was such a hot button issue in their town that it took them 65 years to agree to invest in that. And when they were initially offered help from the USDA, 60 years ago, it would have been a 95% grant and a 5% loan. And by the time they got around to adopting the system, I think they only ended up with a 50% grant and had to pony up, the rest of the money themselves. So I guess just working through that resistance to change in rural communities is something that rural loan officers have to be ready to address. And, really working at the grassroots level um, can help you get a sense of whether or not people in that community will be responsive to the changes that you're suggesting.
Okay, thanks for that. Well, it looks like we've got two questions from Randy, so we'll get to the first one. And he asks, what do you think the financial capital was, or why do you think the financial capital was low with the number of people who talked about it? So I think,
This was something,
go ahead.
the second question ties in a bit. Yeah. Um, this is something that really did surprise me in our results, but the more I thought about it, I think you can explain it by that the people we spoke with, their whole job is to provide business resources to rural firms. So I guess if that were my job, I would have a very positive outlook, because in the back of my mind, I think of all of these financial resources that I could connect the firms with, and that's my job. That's what I do every day. So, from the perspective of someone who is an expert in connecting firms with those resources, they probably, have a hard time seeing why the firm wouldn't take advantage of all those resources that they deal with day in and day out. So I think it's because of the role that they were in. And to touch your second question, do I think financing is the main issue for these businesses? Um, I don't know if I would say it's the main issue, but I think it is more significant than our study represents, because of, you know, the people we interviewed are the resource providers. So I think it is very significant, but I think I would still say that the resistance to change is the main issue.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Um, so, Rachel, there's a question for me. I've got two questions I want to pose real quick and see if anybody else is going to add to the questions. Um, so, was there a pattern of feedback based on maybe where the interviewee worked? For example, at the SBDC or USDA RD Extension, et cetera, and the kinds of responses that you got. So, did you notice, for example, that the folks in Extension focused on one kind of thing, and the focus people in SBDC focused on another? Did you see some sort of pattern like that?
Just a little bit. I felt like the people from Extension and USDA Rural Development had some great stories about how technology adoption really impacts communities. So I don't know, I think that was really cool for me to learn about how, uh, a business adopting a technology isn't just going to help that business, it's going to help everybody. So I really liked how those two groups of interviewees brought that forward. Um, and then incubators were really interesting to chat with because they work with people who are just in the stages of launching technology. So they weren't so much about adopting technology as they were about launching it. Um, so I think they were a little bit less optimistic than some others just because they see so many ideas fail. But having, respondents along, different stages of the innovation process, I think helped us get a really complete picture of this issue.
Okay, cool. Well, thanks for that. Well, I've got one more question for you, and then we'll looks like we'll jump over to this our conclusion page. So, um, what in thinking about the technology adoption, which is kind of the primary focus on what the broad picture was thinking about, what would you say was probably the most interesting story that you heard related to a firm and technology adoption from one of your interviewees?
Oh man, that's really hard. um, I really enjoyed talking with so many people. Um, but I liked that conducting this study showed me how much I don't know. And one of the very first interviews that I did, someone was about to tell me a story, and before they started, they said, "How much do you know about milking cows?" And I was like, honestly, not very much. And then they proceeded to tell me about robotic milkers and just, what a huge change that has made in the dairy industry, and they showed some regional differences between how that's been implemented so quickly and easily in Michigan and how in the Appalachian region it's been very slow to catch on because of some financial barriers. So I think that was probably my favorite just because it showed me that I was, really outside of my comfort zone. But I, very much enjoyed learning more about agriculture and about rural communities, and everybody was just really a pleasure to talk to.
Okay, well, Rachel, thank you so much for that. So I've popped up the poll questions again. So if you did not have a chance to answer those, please feel free to take a minute and fill those out. And also for the last question, if you've got a story, I would really like to hear that story. So you can put that into the chat box. And so with that, I guess we'll go ahead and wrap up. So before we conclude, Rachel, do you have any parting thoughts?
I just want to thank everybody for participating, and I'm really excited about this first stage of the study. And I think it's good that in a way we're left with more questions than answers. And just glancing through your guys' responses to this last question, you point out that, even though all these resources are available, sometimes firms just don't know where to get started. So something I'm really interested in is, is there a way that these different groups that we interviewed who offer several different types of support to firms. Can there be a map created that shows firms who to contact when and for what issue? Maybe a really simple resource like that could address some of these barriers. So I'm just really excited about the future direction of the study and grateful for the opportunity to be involved in this initial stage. And thanks everybody for taking an interest.
Okay, well, Rachel, thank you again. So in wrapping up, I want to make sure everybody knows that the link to the webinar, if you scroll up in the chat box, we're going to post it on YouTube, and so it'll be there tomorrow. And also my email address is there, so if you've got any questions or comments, please feel free to email me. And so with that, I want to say thanks again to our presenter, Rachel Poole, and thanks to you and the audience for participating.